People with disabilities have a long history in relation to looking at their issues through the human rights lens and the social model of disability. And they were the ones who, I suppose, from a grassroots-led movement, really created the social model to enable the rest of the world to understand how their lives are. So I suppose people with disabilities, since the last 40, 50 years, have been carving out a very clear and specific understanding of how they want to be seen in the world. And I suppose the social model has enabled them to do that. And I mean, I suppose the social model and the various iterations of that have emerged in disability discourse. But I suppose, in essence, what is it? It is about viewing the person with the disability in terms of their environment, the attitudes, the behavioural, and they're looking for changes in those environments to enable and empower them to be part and to achieve their maximize their independence and be active citizens and participants in their own lives. And I suppose there are so many other institutional barriers and so many attitudinal, physical barriers in place in our society to really, I suppose, to discriminate against people with disabilities. So I suppose, in a way, I think the thinking around this and pushing dementia into the realm of disability, I think has a huge amount of benefits to the disability movement. And I don't even know if we could call it that, but certainly I think viewing dementia as a disability really enables us to think differently about the lives of people with disabilities. And I think and I suppose it's been happening very organically as well, but I think facilitating the voice of people with dementia and giving people their voice is essential to that social model. And we've seen that happen in pockets, and there's some good practice pieces around the place, but I suppose there's a lot more systemic change that needs to happen in terms of really giving and facilitating the voice of the person with dementia and to be self-determining and to be and maximize their participation and achieve their independence. Not discounting the realities of living with dementia and all the impact that has cognitively, emotionally, and the impact it has on your relationships and on how you can live your life. But I suppose the social model of disability, if we were to utilize that as a way to, I suppose, renew our understanding of what dementia is, I think we would be on a different trajectory. And I really feel that if we had the opportunity to really embed social model, human rights principles in organizations, both working with dementia and in the broader community of organizations and services that people avail of, I think we'd be on a very, very different trajectory altogether. So I do think that the UNCRPD and our human rights legislation has a role to play, but I think the thinking and the philosophy and the principles that the social model embraces gives so many opportunities for us to, as you say, reframe, rethink, and facilitate a new discourse around, a new dialogue around what the lived experience of dementia really is. So my name is Grainne McGettrick. So I currently work with the Acquired Brain Injury Ireland as Policy and Research Manager. For 10 years, I worked with the Alzheimer Society of Ireland, working in the policy and research space as well. So my name is Grainne McGettrick. So I currently work with the Acquired Brain Injury Ireland as Policy and Research Manager. For 10 years, I worked with the Alzheimer Society of Ireland, working in the policy and research space as well. And I suppose over that time, one of the things that we had started was to begin that discourse around human rights, social model and dementia. And I was involved with Mental Health Foundation. And I suppose over that time, one of the things that we had started was to begin that discourse around human rights, social model and dementia. And I was involved with Mental Health Foundation in developing the paper, Social Model of Disability and Dementia. There is some thinking about how you implement human rights principles in your everyday practice. And so this panel principles, and really they relate back to how people, how you're facilitating the people that are affected by the issue, how you're facilitating their participation in your organization. So are they members of your board? Are they on your working groups? Are they in key decision-making roles? Are they being facilitated and supported to participate in an appropriate and active way in the organizational structures? Are they on your staff? Are you genuinely consulting with them in relation to the issues that are affecting them, and how you're delivering your services, or whatever it is, whatever change it is you want to achieve in the world? So I think organizations have to probably rethink a little bit around that. And I think even in terms of resources and making your organization able to and empowered to facilitate that change, I think you need to really rethink about how you rethink your structures, rethink your resources, and how you really genuinely engage with people with dementia in this particular case in relation to your everyday business. So I think that's a really one very practical way. And I suppose, again, we've seen pockets of good practice, particularly in PPI and research, where people with dementia have been involved and are, I suppose, genuine partners. And I suppose the whole idea of project development and co-creation and bringing people with you, people that are affected with the lived experience with you. And I suppose I have experience of that in my own working life. And I can tell you that impact of bringing in the lived experience is so powerful. Really, you can, it's just extraordinary the change it brought. And a very simple example was, we were doing a very short animation video around our research priorities, and we brought in some people with the lived experience, and they brought a completely different hue to the project. They changed it from the first sentence to the last sentence and everything in between. So I really think that's a very empowering way to involve people, but I suppose it has to be genuine, and it has to be led from the top. So a few people down at the bottom, shuffling the deck doesn't really cut it. It has to be a really strategic commitment, and it has to be led from the top. So I think that's one really great way to embed, social model human rights in the work. I suppose there are a whole range of other things that we can do. And I suppose I've talked before, but language is so powerful, and words and how we describe things and image. And I suppose in this fast world of social media, imagery is so critical. And so how we portray, how we talk about the language we use, or the language we shouldn't use around dementia is really, I think, another very powerful and practical tool that we can, so we have to really challenge our thinking around this. And the image that we're using, for example, in a fundraising context, the wrinkly old hands and the 10 people sitting around a table in a nursing home, that's not real life people with dementia. So I really think we have to really challenge how we're portraying dementia. And again, part of that dialogue has to include the person themselves. So I suppose it kind of goes back to the old Kitwood thing, isn't it? The person-centeredness, putting the person back at the center of everything you do. And I can guarantee you that will change the dynamic of how you work and change the dynamic of your organization. And I think then the other part is, like, we have some human rights instruments, I suppose, at our disposal. So we have equality legislation and anti-discrimination legislation, and we have the UN CRPD. So I think we need to be smart about how we can use those to be to our advantage, and to really bring some test cases. I think, and I know some organizations have been doing some good work on that, but I think upping the ante, and I think, educating stakeholders, educating ourselves in the dementia community, but equally educating the wider stakeholder community, and an emphasis on really getting a better understanding of the social model issues, or how it's framed and how it's understood, and how we practice in a day-to-day basis. So I think there are probably layers to what we can do to make human rights really embedded in our everyday worlds. And then I suppose it's the whole, I suppose if you want to think about it in terms of policy issues, how we can frame dementia and dementia rights and human rights from a social policy perspective, and what the government is doing with that. So really trying to influence, I suppose, dementia strategy delivery, or dementia influencing policy around dementia care, can really, affect change in the longer term as well. I know that's a big game to play, but I think to really to have systemic change, I think it has to happen at the policy level, and you have to have all your stakeholders singing off the same hymn sheet around that. So I think, policy can lead to change. The interesting and dynamic part of the shift, I suppose, towards a human rights-based approach would be that you would try and influence disability policy. And I think national disability policy has absolutely has to include the needs of the person with dementia. And I think it's a great way to straddle the two, not ignoring any of the health issues and the health policy issues, and the service requirements and the service supports that people with dementia need, and specific to a dementia strategy. I think the wider disability policy development could really bring about some interesting change in the lives of people with dementia. And I really do think that that will require a fairly seismic shift in thinking. I do think that dementia isn't really ever referred to as a disability, but I think it would open up a whole new space for people with dementia to be active citizens, to be recognised as, co-creators in the services that they need. And I think there's so much from disability that dementia can learn about, because, they're pretty good. They've done a lot of good service development stuff and a lot of evolution away from kind of old medical model style service development towards social models. So even the language is much more understood now, and I think accepted and embedded in practice. So I think there's so much the dementia rights movement can learn from the disability rights movement, but equally to be seen, I think, as to be accepted in as equal partners, and to be recognised as a partner in that in what's happening in the world of disability. So everything, and then you're talking about housing issues, you're talking about transport issues, you're talking about access to appropriate payments, you're talking about the cost of disability payment, so I actually think that I think that opens up a really new and dynamic space for people with dementia. But equally, I think we have to be really respectful as well, that some people with dementia don't want to be labelled as having a disability. So I do think there's something about there's something interesting in that dynamic, isn't there? There's something about not labeling people and not wanting to label and give people, and not further stigmatize or whatever, so I think there's a bit of, there's something we have to play with a little bit there, and accepting that's not for every person with dementia, but equally that if at least the opportunity is there to be part of that wider disability movement, and to be included in any policy developments around disability. I think that can certainly would change the dynamic. You have to make it practical and meaningful and people with dementia have to see the end game. And I suppose dementia advocacy hasn't it? It's just been a joy to watch that flourish over the last really 2 decades. I remember working in the Alzheimer Society, and to think that a person with dementia would be even coming to a meeting or sitting around our meeting table with the working group or whatever, so that advocacy piece has been really tremendous, and has brought us to some new places where I don't think, 20 years ago you wouldn't have dreamed of. Or you would have dreamed of, but you kind of wonder, will we ever get there? Advocacy is such a practical way to realise your human rights. And that's what I would see most of what's going on in terms of working groups of people with dementia. And even though it mightn't be too explicit, I think implicit in all of the work that those groups are doing, including the work that yourselves in Innovation in Dementia is doing, it is about, isn't it, facilitating the voice, giving people, empowering people, educating people, giving people the language to use. And that's no different to what happened in the disability rights movement in the 70s, where they utilised the whole, reframed their thinking, reframed the language, reframed how they wanted the world to understand disability. So I think advocacy is a really, really powerful, strong tool. But advocacy has to be supported, it has to be facilitated, it has to be resourced. It can't be at the bottom of the pile of an organisation's priorities. It has to be led, so it's all, so we can't have lip service. I suppose that's the other thing, we have, so I really think you need to push the boat out in terms of facilitating voice. And I suppose it has to be, as I say, properly resourced and properly led. I think the other key instrument that we can use to implement and support the individual with dementia's human rights and is really around recognising their capacity to make decisions. And I think the legislation in the past has really played a very negative role in terms of, you either have capacity or you don't. And, certainly here in Ireland it was part of a lunatic act of 18 whatever. So I do think that we've progressed a huge amount in those areas, and I think we've learned a lot from other countries. And I think having good capacity legislation that's embedded in it with human rights principles will really make a difference in the lives of people with dementia. I think it's going to present a challenge to all of those people who are used to working in a particular way and having all the authority and all of the, so I think it'll be a sea change in terms of trying and the person with dementia regaining their power and bringing back, regaining what they've lost for so many years as a result of this kind of archaic legislation. So I think capacity legislation and good implementation of that and good guidance is really a key player in protecting the human rights of the individual with dementia.